Hello, my ecosystem people, and welcome back. I hope you're doing well. It's Friday, April 3rd, and we're continuing with our lake stuff this week. Next week is wetland week. Very excited about that. Thanks to Henry for doing a lovely presentation on lakes. If you haven't already watched that, get yourself some popcorn, get a nice beverage, kick back, enjoy it, and then post a comment or a question for Henry to respond to. I'm delighted to see that many of you were able to go out to a stream for Streamlab. If you didn't, that's okay. If you did the online maximized part, that's fine. So very good. If you haven't turned that in, make sure you do. And then you have a small lake lab that's due next Wednesday. So make sure you're keeping up on all of that. So let's talk a little lake restoration. Just like we looked at stream restoration, there are some ways that people try to restore lakes that have been degraded. And here's a little table that kind of breaks it down into two parts. And we've talked about this a little bit already. Some of these are bottom up and some of them are top down. So these at the top here we'll talk about first. Whoops, went too far. About there are what I would call bottom up measures. That means that they're trying to deal with nutrient issues. And you can see the very first one is nutrient diversion. And then something called phosphorus immobilization, oxidation, dredging, and hypolimnetic withdrawal. So we'll take a quick look at all of those today. And then the bottom part here, these are top-down approaches. So biomanipulation, fish elimination, piscivore stocking, planktivore removal, benthivore removal, and habitat modification. So we'll go through these pretty quickly. First of all, the first one is nutrient diversion. So this should make sense to you. In a lot of cases, a lake is eutrophic because it has a big nutrient inflow, either from a river or maybe from a surface water flow or groundwater flow. In this chart, the blue arrows represent water flow and the red arrows represent nutrient flow. So it could be from a point source, like here is a factory that might have an effluent pipe leading out into a lake. Maybe it's getting nutrients from deposition or groundwater, but usually it's coming from a surface water flow. So the most obvious thing to do is to divert that nutrient flow somewhere else. And historically, here I'll get on my wetlands bandwagon. Historically and prehistorically, we used to have wetlands alongside rivers and streams, and any kind of nutrient flow from the surface would flow into a wetland, and it would go through the wetland for weeks, sometimes before it made it to the lake, and those nutrients would get used up and sequestered or transformed by the wetland. We have drained lots of our wetlands, and so those nutrients make it right to the lake. So diverting this nutrient flow can sometimes at least alleviate that stress on a lake. Of course, you might have to ask, where is that diversion going to go? If it just goes into the next river, well, then it's going to flow into the lake downstream or to the bay downstream. So it might just move the pollution around. But that's the immediate thing you can do, is divert the nutrient inflow. Second thing you can do is make some chemical additions to a lake that might bind up the phosphorus. So we talked about the problem of internal phosphorus loading this week. And so hopefully you remember that. As phosphorus gets into a lake, it can do what's called internal cycling. The labile forms of it settle to the bottom, and then as they encounter anoxic waters, they become free, and then with turnover or mixing, they can get right back to the surface and cause the next algae bloom. This looks like a coronavirus over here. Whoops, it's not. I think it's trying to show you bound molecules. Anyway, one thing you can do to help alleviate this problem is to add some chemicals to the water that might bind up that phosphorus and lock them so that they don't go back into solution. So iron or aluminum or lanthanum, there are a variety of chemicals that can be added to a lake that don't cause immediate and obvious harm to any of the organisms, but what they do is they bind up phosphorus into some sort of inert, immobile compound that sinks to the bottom. And now it's locked up, and essentially it becomes part of the sediment and it doesn't go back into solution. You could do this for a small lake. It would be way too expensive to try to do it for a large lake like the size of Lake Erie. But if you had a small lake that had a phosphorus problem, potentially you could try to bind the phosphorus. And for the most part, this has been used to some success in smaller lakes. Lake oxidation. So we talked about how in eutrophic situations, the hypolimnion, the lower waters of the lake, become anoxic. for reasons that we discussed, mostly because respiration is more prevalent than photosynthesis in those bottom waters. So you could just add oxygen to the lake. Here are some examples in smaller lakes or ponds where you could add a fountain or a bubbler. Sometimes these are even installed at the bottom of a lake to bubble oxygen, sort of like an aquarium bubbler. Again, you could do this on a small scale. Trying to do this on a scale of any size lake that's big would be prohibitively expensive and really energetically expensive too. So farm pond, this work well for, or smaller size lakes. But in general, if you have a larger lake, you're not going to be able to oxygenate it just with air pumps. Sometimes in lakes, they try to dredge out or scoop out the sediment that is loaded with phosphorus, because that is the source of that internal phosphorus loading. So this is a messy and somewhat destructive process of scooping or suctioning the water or muck from the bottom of the lake, putting it onto barges, or just dumping it off to the side and then trucking it somewhere that's outside of that watershed, maybe to spread on a farmer's field as a fertilizer. If you just dump it next to the bank, next time it rains, it's going to wash right back into the lake, so you don't want to do that. But a lot of times this is exported and used as a fertilizer somewhere else. Buckeye Lake in southern Licking County has done this to try to remove their phosphorus problem. It's fairly destructive. Like I said, it destroys a lot of bottom habitat. It makes the water very turbid for a period of time. It's kind of a case of last resort. It's kind of a nasty way of dealing with the problem. But for a small lake, it could be effective. Hypolimnetic withdrawal is our last one, and this is exactly what it sounds like. Stick a big old straw or a pipe down into the hypolimnion of a lake, and you're going to remove that nutrient-rich water. Mostly it's the phosphorus you're trying to remove, and I guess you'll remove some nitrogen too. So you're pumping out that bottom water continually and pumping it somewhere else. And of course, the question again is, where's that water going to go? But if you can send it to another watershed, or maybe send it somewhere that needs a fertilizer, you could use it as a fertilizer. It's fairly cheap. All you're really running is a water pump, and you can actually reduce the phosphorus load. This example says from 200 milligrams per liter down to 91 milligrams per liter, so less than half of the original. So that's another way of trying to remove phosphorus so that it doesn't just come back up to the surface in the next turnover event. All of these are, feasible for small-sized lakes, but really not for very big lakes. Okay, back to our chart here. So those are some examples of bottom-up ideas. Top-down, I think you're already kind of familiar with, but you remember this idea. So we have piscivores, those are fish that eat fish, and then planktivores, fish that eat zooplankton. And then here's our zooplankton. These are things like Daphnia that swim around through the water and eat algae cells or phytoplankton. Here's our algae or phytoplankton. And then of course we have the nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, other nutrients that stimulate algae growth. So we've talked about the bottom up, where nutrients can stimulate that algae growth. Top down, of course, would be manipulating this food chain. And this has sort of historically been done mostly in lakes with fish, because fish are sort of captive in a lake. They can't exactly leave very well, and you can kind of easily control some of the different trophic levels. You can't really do that as easily in a forest or a grassland. So this is called biomanipulation, and a couple ideas. One would be to stock the lake with piscivores. So for example, in this little, the picture on the left here says if you have more piscivores, you could rear these and stock these in a lake, then you're going to have fewer planktivores because they'll get eaten by the piscivores. That means you'll have more zooplankton and you'll have less algae, less phytoplankton. So it's sort of using that trophic cascade to control the algae. And all you really did was stock some big prize game fish that people like to fish for anyway. So that seems like a pretty good idea. The other extreme, I guess, what you don't want is to overfish or overharvest those large piscivores, because then you have more planktivores, and then you have fewer zooplankton, and then you have more algae. This was kind of the Lake Tahoe scenario that we talked about last time, where you can actually get more algae growth even though you didn't add more nutrients because you've changed the trophic structure above it. So yeah, some lakes have done this. They have manipulated, especially adding piscivores or predators seems to be a popular approach, and you can do this in a bigger lake. So Lake Erie, for example, you can stock walleye, or you can stock predators. Now, it's not going to have an immediate effect, and it's not going to solve all your problems, but in general, it will help to keep the algae down unless it's overwhelmed by a nutrient load, which Lake Erie sometimes is. Sometimes those predators can leave. Like I said, not so much fish, although sometimes there's an outflow and fish can leave a lake or they get harvested from a lake. They could get eaten by something, right? So if a bird could swoop down and catch a fish, so there might be a way that you lose some of those. But for the most part, you are manipulating that in order to manipulate the primary production. The other box over here, these are ways that you could control the nutrient load, what we call the load. So there's the load of phosphorus, let's say, and the landscape and the land use, the hydrology, the geomorphic setting, all of that goes into what labile primary nutrients do you have, nitrogen or phosphorus. And so this is where the biomanipulation part sort of runs into the structural, geomorphic, and nutrient load, where those two collide. Okay, so those are just some looks at how you might try to restore a lake, but there's a lot of hysteresis here. You guys know that word now. I heard Henry use that word correctly, so good job, Henry. And it's difficult to bring a lake back that wasn't a clear oligotrophic setting that has now become eutrophic. It's very, very difficult and slow process to get it back, if ever you can. Okay, so this was short today because it's Friday. Happy Friday to you. So I'm going to end here, but I put a lake puzzler that you should take a look at on Notebowl Bulletin. If you were in class all together, I would give you this and have you puzzle over it and think about it and see if you can answer the questions that I posed. I took it from a study on a lake that has a little bit of a nutrient problem and it's got a little bit of a toxic algae problem. So take a look at it and then post your comments or questions to each other or your answers to each other on Notebowl Bulletin, and we'll see if you can figure this out without my help. And I bet you can because you're smart. Next week is Wetlands Week. I think we're hearing from Kevin. That'll be very exciting to hear Kevin's presentation about wetlands. And that's our third type of aquatic ecosystem. So make sure you do the readings on that. We're also sneaking up on your next quiz, which is a week from Monday. So next week I will be giving you a review sheet and talking to you a little bit about how we're going to do that quiz. So have a good weekend and stay healthy.